Mr. Speaker, there are, on page 17 of the document, table entitled Medium-Term Fiscal Program, there are revenue projections from 2022 all the way down to 2028. Mr. Speaker.
What is the revenue projection for 2022?
For 2022, it's 3.8 trillion. 2028, it goes all the way up to 6.6 trillion.
And what is, or what are the basis for these projections?
Mr. Speaker, I would surmise, if I were to do I did not generate these calculations, but if I were to do it, I would come up with a growth model, predict GDP growth rate for the next 6 years, and then just assume or have a target collection rate, which is what was done in the table. That would be the resulting target for the next 6 years, Mr. Speaker.
That is the problem of this MTFF. We are given targets, but we are not given insights of how the targets would be achieved. Now, for example, there is a target of 9% poverty incidence by 2028. Would the distinguished lady confirm that?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Now, have we in the past achieved this low poverty incidence?
Not in recent history, Mr. Speaker. The reason for why we are currently at about 18% poverty incidence is because of the recent spike resulting from the pandemic. So we were on a downward trend. I believe we had reached, I think, 12 or 13%. But then, of course, that trend changed because of the pandemic and the Taal volcano eruption. So, short answer, what's the reason for why there was a downtrend prior to these fortuitous events? Part of it is success of the 4 Ps. Yan naman talaga po. Ang dahilan po kung bakit isa siyang programa na ina-expect po natin na siya nagsusolve ng poverty problem, it's because simple lang naman po yung layunin ng programa. So long as you keep your children in school, you will get a cash transfer. So yung cash transfer is the incentive to keep kids in school. And so, noong nagkaroon po tayo ng first graduates ng 4 Ps, unti-unti pong bumaba ang ating poverty incidence. Kaya nga lang po, nagkaroon tayo ng pandemic at yan ang dahilan po kung bakit naiba po ang trend in recent years. Pero ang aking palagay, because the MTFF precisely states that the 4 Ps continues to be the flagship program for poverty reduction and human capital, I believe that we can easily return to that downward trend, Mr. Speaker.
My question was very simple, Mr. Speaker, distinguished lady. Have we achieved in the past a 9% poverty incidence?
My answer was also simple. I said not in recent history, and I began to explain why, Mr. Speaker.
How about in the past?
For sure, Mr. Speaker, at one point, it was 9%. I don't exactly remember when that was. That was maybe decades ago. It was a different context altogether. Our population was not as big as it is today. It was a different socio-political context, which perhaps arguably is not relevant. But what I believe is relevant is the recent downward trend in poverty incidence, Mr. Speaker.
For example, during the martial regime, what was the poverty incidence?
Mr. Speaker, bata pa po ako noon. Baka mas naalala niyo pa po if you can share with us that figure, we would appreciate that, Mr. Speaker.
Now, during the time of President Corazon Aquino, what was the poverty incidence?
Mr. Speaker, the kind gentleman from Albay does not have the data with him. I would like to ask for a suspension, 2-minute suspension, just to get the data, Mr. Speaker.
Session suspended for 3 minutes.
Very good. Opo. Takot naliligo. Takot liligo. Ba't mo natakot?
The Honorable Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that we recognize once more the Honorable Lady from Marikina, Stella Luz Kimbo, and the gentleman from Albay, the distinguished Representative Ed Salagman, to continue with his interpellation.
Please proceed, Your Honors.
Mr. Speaker, I have a pending question.
Please proceed, Your Honor.
I think we are waiting for the response of the distinguished lady.
Yes,
The Honorable Kimbo is recognized.
yes, Mr. Speaker, just to refresh our minds, the distinguished gentleman from Albay asked if there was ever a point in time that we had a poverty incidence of 9%. And the answer is no.
So this is a very ambitious projection, Mr. Speaker, not parallel in any administration in the past. As I have said in my contrasona, most probably it is more imaginary than imaginative.
Mr. Speaker,
But we are not given any inputs on how 9% poverty incidence would be achieved by 2028. We wish it could happen, but it is hard to happen considering many factors which are deterrent to the alleviation of poverty, which must be addressed. And I will go to my next point relative to this.
Mr. Speaker, if I
The
may.
lady from Marikina is recognized for her reply.
Although we had not yet achieved the 9% poverty incidence, it is worth noting, Mr. Speaker, that there is a sharp downward trend in poverty incidence. So that is what makes this 9% realistic. So and besides, Mr. Speaker, it is a target. It is a target. Keeping in mind again that as soon as we begin to expand 4Ps program, which continues to be our flagship poverty reduction program, 9% is arguably a reasonable number, a reasonable target, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Albay for his next question.
Yes, may we know from the distinguished lady why the issue on population is not included in the medium-term fiscal framework?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there is no specific item on population policy, but it is implied in many of these socioeconomic targets. So particularly for, again, I go back to strengthening social protection, I go back to tackling health. So these are very important programs that, or whose success actually depends on how well we manage our population growth. So simple lang naman po yun, Mr. Speaker, kung dumadami masyado ang tao beyond what we had projected, talagang mahihirapan po tayo mag-deliver ng social services. So to the extent na ini-internalize natin ang adhikain na mag-provide ng adequate social services, tingin ko po, implicitly, natatakal na rin natin ang ating population policy.
The problem is, Speaker, with implications. They could go wild and weird. That's why it is very important that we should go to specifics. No less than a great Filipino, the first executive secretary of the late Ferdinand Marcos Sr., Rafael Salas said 50 years ago that the population issue and family planning should be components, integral components of sustainable human development. This MTFF and MTFF is virtually on sustainable human development. That is why it is important that the issue on population should be included in this framework. It is again about human development. And let me just say that the funding for progressive population and family planning is not expensive. It is not as expensive as mega projects, which would entail billions and billions of pesos, and where the beneficiaries are even less than the beneficiaries of reproductive health. That is why, to my mind, it is very urgent, it's very important that population issues and family planning should be an integral component of this framework. Now, let me go to another, because I understand there are others who would like to ask their questions. What is the reason and effect of Bangko Central's increase of the interest rates?
Mr. Speaker, again, it's a way to manage inflation. So, pag tumataas kasi po ang interest rate sa Amerika, ang ibig sabihin nun, mas tumataas ang demand for dollar-denominated assets, in which case, relatively speaking, mas tumataas ang demand for US dollars vis-a-vis Philippine pesos. At kapag humihina ang demand for Philippine pesos, nagde-depreciate ang ating piso. At dahil po very dependent po tayo sa mga imported na commodities, yun po, tumataas ang presyo ng mga bilihin locally. And so, when interest rates increase abroad, at a certain point, it would be good for us to also increase our interest rates so that we mitigate the increase in demand for US dollars vis-a-vis the Philippine peso. So in a way, we're trying to make the Philippine-denominated assets more attractive, and in which case that would strengthen the peso. And that would be a way also to quell inflation expectations so that ultimately, yun po ang magiging paraan para bumaba ang presyo ng bilihin, Mr. Speaker.
Will this increase in interest rates, and it is expected that increases could still be made, be a disincentive to investment and production?
Well, Mr. Speaker, merong ganon na kailangan i-consider. This is not an easy call for the BSP. On one hand, as they increase interest rates, that's a way to manage inflation expectations and therefore manage actual inflation outcomes. But on the other hand, meron din pong ganon na sinasabi na this might be passed on to interest rates of consumer loans as well as interest rates of business loans, particularly for MSMEs. But mabigat po ang aking paniniwala sa BSP. They are very technically equipped. They are an independent agency. Sa aking palagay ay itinimbang nila itong dalawang posibleng mangyari. And so in the end, there was a modest interest rate hike, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Now, aside from the increasing the interest rates, what are the other modes of controlling or mitigating the escalating inflation rate?
Mr. Speaker, inflation today is a cost push phenomenon. Ang dahilan kung bakit tumataas ang presyo ay hindi dahil sa demand side, kundi dahil sa supply side considerations. Ibig sabihin, tumataas kasi ang cost of production. At bakit tumataas ang cost of production? Dahil sa mga bagay na wala tayong control, tulad ng digmaan sa Russia at Ukraine. So, that's the situation today, Mr. Speaker. So, yan ang dahilan kung bakit sa ilalim ng MTFF, ang kailangan gawin is to address the impact of inflation. At yan din ang dahilan kung bakit kinakailangan to strengthen our social services.
Yeah, I think so. I think the social services should really be intensified, but I do not see that in the MTFF. Anyway, let me go to something a little parochial. In typhoon and calamity-stricken areas like the Bicol region, how can face-to-face schooling be fully implemented when numerous school buildings and classrooms are still in disrepair and new classrooms have not been constructed to accommodate new and more enrollees?
Mr. Speaker, I must admit, palaisipan kung paano natin ipapatupad ang safe return to face-to-face classes. At yan din siguro ang dahilan kung bakit ginagawa natin siya unti-unti. So ngayong Agosto, sinisimulan natin on a pilot basis ang pagbabalik ng ating mga estudyante, 2 to 3 days lamang sa isang linggo. And by November, ay saka natin gagawin ang full return to face-to-face classes. So palagay ko po, ito ang isa sa dahilan kung bakit natin inunti-unti para mahanap natin ang mga mahihirap na katanungan tungkol sa paano ito ipapatupad. But again, katungkulan natin dito sa Kongreso na siguraduhin na sa pag-aproba ng budget ay maglaan tayo ng sapat na pondo para masigurado ang mabilis at safe na pagbabalik ng face-to-face classes, Mr. Speaker.
Well, these disaster-stricken classrooms were damaged 2 years ago, and until now, they are in disrepair. Now, why is it, Mr. Speaker, distinguished lady, the implementation of right sizing has invariably resulted to the bloating of the bureaucracy. The MTFF talks about right sizing, but that is the invariable result. Since the time, shortly, even during the Commonwealth, and in the Republic, and after EDSA, all right sizing and the organization plans resulted to the bloating of the bureaucracy instead of trimming down, rationalizing the bureaucracy. Why is that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, just from casual observation sa ating mga budget hearing, ang isa sa dahilan sa aking palagay ay dahil napakaraming inflexibilities sa ating gobyerno sa pag-hire ng personnel. So, for example, in every agency, there is a specified number of plantilla position, X% of which would be for administrative position, the remaining would be for technical positions. That, unfortunately, is always cast in stone. Hindi pwedeng lumabag doon sa maximum na yan. Sa ibang mga ahensya, katulad ng pinanggalingan ko na ahensya, which is the Philippine Competition Commission, na napaka-technical ng kanyang gawain, minsan, or maraming beses, nagtataka kami kung bakit mas maraming plantilla positions para sa administrative work kumpara sa technical. And in the end, we end up having to hire consultants, job orders, etc. So tingin ko, yan ay isang dahilan kung bakit nagkakaroon tayo ng isang bloated bureaucracy. Napakaraming inflexibilities. Kaya, that's one. And number two, palagay ko, Mr. Speaker, panahon na para magkaroon tayo ng isang proper job audit. So sa bawat ahensya, dapat i-review ng bawat ahensya kung anong mandato nila at gumawa ng time and motion studies kung ilan ba talaga ang personnel na kailangan para makamit ang mandato na yon. Sa ngayon po, walang ganun eh. So when agencies are created, there is an assumed number of plantilla positions kahit hindi pa nag-uumpisa ang isang ahensya. And it's only later on after the fact na natutuklasan ng bagong ahensya na hindi pala ito ang sapat na bilang ng administrative and technical positions. So again, ang tingin ko, ito ay isa rin sa mga inflexibilities sa ating bureaucracia, Mr. Speaker.
And one important factor is political patronage. And to a new administration, and this would be a very serious challenge. And I suppose that the MTFF should be able to project how to contain the ballooning of the bureaucracy. Now, I understand there are more who would like to ask questions. I am asking my last question, although I have many other questions. If I have the time, after the others have already made that interpellation, I would reserve my right to continue my interpellation. Now, R&D is mentioned in the MTFF. May we know, distinguished lady, what is the UN prescribed ratio of research and development programs to the national budget?
Mr. Speaker, may I have 1 minute just to check?
Session suspended.
Ikaw na. Okay, friends. Kaya nag-promise ako kasi alas 4 to. Kaya pag-hito na ako eh. Para mapagbigyan naman kayo. Joey. Kami lang ni Joey ang natitira sa 8th Congress. The remnants of the 8th Congress. I promise 20 minutes on okay.
So where are we now?
Mr. Speaker, I move that we resume and conclude the interpellation of the Honorable Lagman on House Concurrent Resolution number 2.
Temporarily conclude.
Mr. Speaker, may I? So, Mr. Speaker,
Proceed, Madam.
Mr. Speaker, the UN suggests for developing countries to spend 1% of its GDP on R&D, although the global average is about 2.04% of GDP, Mr. Speaker.
The UNESCO, Mr. Speaker, distinguished lady, prescribes an R&D to GDP ratio of 2%. The Philippines ratio has been below 1%. It's 0.16% in 2015 and 0.32% in 2018. And I think under this framework, we should be able to achieve what the UNESCO has prescribed. Thank you, distinguished lady, for accommodating my questions. And I reiterate my reservation that if there will be more time, I will continue with my interpellation while I give way to other members of the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, distinguished lady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move to recognize Representative Franz Castro of the ACT Teachers Party List for her interpellation.
The Honorable Franz Castro is recognized for her interpellation.
Maraming salamat, Ginoong Speaker. Magandang hapon po sa ating kapwa kinatawan at sa ating mga mamamayan. So, ang aking katanungan sa ating napakagandang kinatawan mula sa Marikina will be revolving, Sir Speaker, on growth and poverty. Okay? So yung una po sinasabi natin na so on the MTFF objectives, 6.5 to 7.5 real GDP growth rate in 2022 and then 6.5 to 8% in 2023 to 2028. So masasabi po ba natin, Mr. Speaker, na itong target na ito ay realistic? At ano po yung mga ano po yung mga indicators that we will achieve this target to 2028? So meron po bang kapag hindi po nakakuha yung target, meron po bang ibang gagawin or meron po bang intervention na gagawin according to the plan?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the projections on growth are reasonable and feasible. So sa ngayon po, in fact, first quarter pa lang ng taong 2022, we had already achieved an 8.27% growth. The forecast for 2022 is 6.5 to 7.5%. Given the first quarter performance of 8.2 And of course, alam naman po natin na sa second quarter, nangyari po ang eleksyon. At tuwing nagkakaroon po tayo ng eleksyon, tumataas po ang spending ng ating bansa, tumataas din ang ating GDP. So sigurado tayo na at least with the first and second quarters, mataas ang ating growth rate. And siguro po, barring any huge typhoons, etc., palagay ko po, very feasible po ang forecasted GDP growth rates for this year, as well as the next 6 years, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So since 2016, during the pre-pandemic years, the Philippine GDP growth rate is already slowing down, correct?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
In 2016, the GDP growth rate is 7.1. It went down to 6.9 in 2017, 6.3 in 2018, and 6.1 in 2019, and negative 9.5 in 2020. And this last year, we have 5.7 in 2021. Despite the fact that the Duterte administration allotted trillions of people's money to prime the economy through infrastructure spending. Okay? So what what do you think will constitute the growth using the infrastructure spending?
Mr. Speaker, alam po natin na ang infrastructure po ay may pinakamalaking tinatawag na multiplier effect. So, yun din ang dahilan kung bakit nagkaroon tayo ng isang build program. Yan ay isang paraan para pabilisin lalo ang paglago ng ating ekonomiya. So, bakit mataas ang multiplier effect ng infrastructure? Dahil po sa laki po ng bilang ng nag-create natin na jobs sa infrastructure. Tuwing meron po tayong isang construction project, syempre po, it's very labor-intensive at ito ang dahilan kung bakit nakakapag-create tayo na napakaraming trabaho tuwing ibinubuhos natin ang ating pera sa infrastructure projects. And at the same time, of course, huwag natin kakalimutan na ang main reason kung bakit kailangan natin ng infrastructure is to promote connectivity. So nandito po ang pag-transport ng mga goods mula sa market, mula sa farm hanggang sa market. Nandiyan din po ang tinatawag na digital connectivity. So apart from the usual infrastructure projects like roads and bridges, syempre kasama din po dito ang ating digital infrastructure tulad ng ating national broadband. And again, I will not belabor the point. Very important na at this point in time magkaroon tayo ng pivot to a digital economy nang sa ganon ay maging mas productive ang ating labor as well as capital resources, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, lagi po sinasabi no na yung infrastructure project would generate more jobs. So, may I ask our sponsor, Mr. Speaker, the data on how many jobs were generated for the past maybe 5 years of the Duterte administration for us to say that it has a multiplier effect and in fact it nag-contribute to the growth of our economy. May have the data of the generated workforce during this ambitious mga infrastructure project na ito.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have the data with me at this point. Posible po ba na ipasubmit na lang po natin sa tanggapan ng minorya? Hihingin po natin mula sa DPWH.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kasi ito po kasi yung sinasabi ninyong dahilan kung bakit when I say na yung growth during the Duterte administration ay bumaba, pero sinasabi natin na yung infrastructure yung nag-contribute doon sa pagtaas. Di po ba? Sana meron tayong ganong data dahil, Mr. Speaker, when we listen to the SONA of our President, sabi niya kasi, i-maintain niya yung mga infrastructure project na na sinimula ng Duterte administration. So ibig sabihin, may pattern. So mahalaga na makita natin, Mr. Speaker, kung ilan talaga yung mga na-generate. Kasi yung growth and poverty incident are related. Kaya gusto natin kung paano nakataas ito doon sa growth rate natin, itong mga infrastructure project na ito. Kasi doon nakatuon ngayon yung...
Mr. Speaker, it's 6.57 million. 6.57 million jobs.
6.57 million. Okay, so what is the quality of this of this job created by this infrastructure? So, ilan po ba dito, Mr. Speaker, yung permanent? Ilan po ba dito yung contract lang? Ilan po ba dito yung by season kasi itong infrastructure project? So can we determine the differences with these jobs generated?
Mr. Speaker, to answer that very specific question, kailangan talaga natin hingin yung datos mula sa NSCB para tignan ng labor force survey. Unfortunately, wala po tayo niyan ngayon. But obviously, admittedly, hindi po ang mga construction workers natin ay hindi tulad ng karamihan sa ating salary and wage earners na talagang merong tenure, ibig sabihin kompleto sa benefits. So admittedly ay hindi ito kasing taas ang kalidad kumpara sa ating salaried and wage earners.
Sige, related po din dun sa sinasabi nating job, yung quality ng job na generate. So, hindi pwedeng pagbasihan ng ng pwedeng maging basis ng growth rate natin yung na-generate na job. Kasi hindi naman din ito magiging permanent na trabaho para sa ating mga mamamayan, So, ito sa 6.57 million na na-generate na job na ito. So, masasabi po ba natin na talagang yung poverty incidence ay talagang nabawasan?
Well, Mr. Speaker, una sa lahat, I stand by my statement earlier na napakataas ng multiplier effects ng infrastructure, ibig sabihin ng kakayahan niya na mag-create ng jobs. Pero of course, hindi naman ito ang tanging solusyon para talagang guminhawa ang buhay ng bawat Pilipino. Yan ang dahilan kung bakit kailangan pa natin ng iba pang mga social services program. Siyempre kasama dyan, halimbawa ang PhilHealth, kasama po dyan ang 4Ps, etc. So, ito ay first step lamang sa pagsisigurado na guminhawa ang buhay ng tao. And of course, any increase in income is always a step towards poverty reduction. Ganun lang po kasimple yun. Kasi ang pag-compute ng poverty incidence has to do with your income. You just simply compare income with the poverty threshold. So, more or less automatic po yan. Every time you increase income, there is always a lower likelihood that you fall below the poverty threshold, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, kanina sa pagtatanong po ni Representative Lagman, sinagot po ng ating kinatawan from Marikina that one of the indicator for poverty, for lowering the poverty incidence is the program of 4Ps. Okay? So, paano kaya, Mr. Speaker, masasabi natin na ito pa rin yung magre-reduce dun sa poverty since di ba nakatakda na 1.3 million na ma-exclude doon sa 4Ps program. And can we say that hindi ba pwede nating tignan na yung secured job, yun talagang magbibigay ng security sa ating mga mamayan for to lower the poverty incidence?
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, we cannot rely on a single program. So although flagship program, kung sabihin ang 4Ps, that will not be the cure-all or the panacea for poverty reduction. So kasama dyan ang various programs that will, for example, promote investments, lower the cost of doing business, again, for purposes of bringing in or attracting investments, not only locally, but also from foreign entities. And ultimately, with more investments, you have more jobs. Mr. Speaker, with more jobs, you have lower poverty rates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'll go now to my next question naman po. Since 2018, on growth rate pa rin po. Since 2018, the government failed to reach its target GDP growth, both the high-end and the lower-end projections. Kasi dito po, Mr. Speaker, dito po sa ating MTFF, meron lower-end and higher-end. For example, in 2018, the targeted GDP growth rate is 6.5, but we only achieved 6.2. In 2019, we targeted between 6% to 6.5, but we only achieved 5.9. In 2021, we only beat the target GDF growth rate after numerous revisions during the year. So nagkaroon po ng iba't ibang mga revisions if the sponsor would remember. If we base it on the earlier 2021 targets, we think we will also fail. Given these facts, how can this administration say that by end of 2022, we will achieve its target, given that since 2000, the high-end target of 8% growth rate has never been reached since 2000?
Mr. Speaker, ang isang dahilan kung bakit hindi natin na-achieve ang forecasted growth rate in the past is because, kung naalala po natin, Mr. Speaker, nagkaroon tayo ng malaking delay sa pagpapasa ng budget. So alam natin na isang source of growth sa bawat bansa is government spending. So the bigger the delays in approving the budget, which means bigger delays in executing the budget or spending the budget, yun ay nagiging direct cause ng hindi natin pag-achieve ng forecasted growth rate. So, mangyayari ba yan in 2023? Nasa sa kamay po natin, mga miyembro ng Kongreso, nasa kamay natin ang agarang pagpasa ng budget para sa 2023, Mr. Speaker.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the proposed budget po natin, Mr. Speaker, in 2022 is 5.02 trillion. In 2023, the proposed budget is 5.68 trillion. So napakaliit na increase ng budget for 2023. So dito sa kaliit na budget na ito, doon sa pinoproject natin growth rate for growth rate for 2023 na 8 something or 6.5 to 8. So ano kaya na magagawa nitong napakaliit na budget nito kung magre-rely tayo sa infrastructure, yung 4Ps, etc. So paano natin ma-achieve kaya kung doon tayo magre-rely halimbawa doon sa sinasabi nating indicators?
Mr. Speaker, admittedly, marami nagsasabi na tila maliit ang increase in budget sa 2023. Pero sa akin po, ang pinaka-importante really is budget execution. Kasi in the past, kahit na sinasabi natin na napakalaki ng increase in budget in 2022 as well as in 2021, as a result of the need to have a proper pandemic response, tayo po dito sa Kongreso taon-taon ay para na tayong sarang plaka at wala na tayong ginawa kundi magreklamo sa mga ahensya sa kabagalan po ng pag-absorb o paggastos ng pera. So ang akin po, kahit sabihin po natin na may kaliitan ang increase in 2023, arguably, as long as we're able to have a more efficient spending in budget, tingin ko po ay hindi maantala po ang ating targets, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While one of the 8-point agenda for the near term is to ensure food security, the MTFF is silent about free land distribution, agrarian reform, rice industry development, support to farmers, fisherfolk, and animal industry, and the repeal of the rice tariffication law, national industrialization, and support to MSMEs. So what is the projection for agriculture and manufacturing industry? The 2021 agriculture share to GDP stood at 9.6%, while manufacturing share GDP is at 19.2%, which is lowest since 1950. So will the Marcos administration continue this trend?
Mr. Speaker, tama po, no? Napaka-laking problema po ng ating agricultural sector. Clearly, there's so much scope to increase its output, and that's the reason for why under the MTFF, naging klaro naman po na importante to prioritize spending on productivity enhancing measures. So kasama na po dito, malawak po ang kategorya na to. Kasama po dyan ang ayudang binibigay sa mga farmers, particularly rice farmers under the RCEP. Ito pong nakukuha natin na taripa mula sa rice. So these are examples of ways by which productivity can be enhanced for farmers. So obviously kasama din po dito ang ilang mga kailangan gawin para tanggalin na rin ang maraming constraints sa land ownership and particularly sale, for example, of land, so that we are able to achieve the optimal size of farms, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So doon naman po ako, no, kasi pinag-uusapan natin ulit yung trabaho. So muli I will ask questions on with this target. Are there any plans on increasing the wages and salaries of workers in both private and public sectors? Note that while the past administration increased the minimum wage in NCR from 537 to 570, 33 is not enough to address rising costs of goods and services. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, it is only under the Duterte administration wherein the real value of wages dropped. According to the NWPC, the current real value of minimum wage in NCR is 570 is just 508, while in Region 5, the minimum 345 is 290.67. Moreover, the current minimum salary in both in both private sector, 290 per day to 570 per day, depending on the region. So ito, ganito kaliit, Mr. Speaker, yung regional minimum salary of this region. So alam natin na yung salary would also generate or would also contribute to the economic development. So are there plans in increasing the wages and salaries of the workers in both public and private?
Mr. Speaker, napaka-importante na protektahan ang welfare ng ating mga manggagawa. But there are many ways to do that. As we know, real wages is really nominal wages divided by prices. So one way is to reduce prices. So very clear po dito sa ating MTFF na addressing inflation is a clear priority. So when that is done, then obviously real wages will increase even if nominal wages are not raised. So that's one. Number two, many surveys would indicate, Mr. Speaker, surveys of workers who would say that napakalaking problema ng inflation, pero syempre, kung sila ay mabibigyan ng trabaho, ay yan ay isang effective way to address inflation. So yan din ang dahilan kung bakit sa MTFF, very important priority ang pagpaparami po ng trabaho. So again, alternative ways to improve worker welfare, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pero if you look at the MFTT, so wala sa target yung wage increase, right? So dun sa 8 plus 8 na mga kahit na doon sa 19-point legislative agenda of the President, so wala doon yung salary increase.
Well, wala po sa 8 points. But again, I go back to my point that it doesn't necessarily mean that we are forgetting to protect the welfare of our workers, Mr. Speaker, because merong alternative ways to do that.
So according to the MFTT, Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons why the inflation accelerated is largely due to significant increases in international prices of oil and key commodities. In the Philippines, we were shocked by almost 100 per liter of diesel in some areas. So, what would be the administration's plan to address rising oil prices?
Well, paulit-ulit naman, Mr. Speaker, ang sinasabi. Well, of course, one is to increase supply. So kung meron mga alternative power sources, of course, yan ang dapat pagtugunan ng ating Department on Energy, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Thank you. Higher inflation rate means more expensive prices of goods and services. Since February 2022, our inflation rate is rapidly going up. From 3% in January and February, it went up to 4% in March, 4.9% in April, 6% in June. So the PSA noted that the recent June inflation is the highest inflation rate recorded since October 2018. The PSA also pointed out that the uptrend of inflation for June 2022 was primarily brought out by higher annual growth rate in the index for food and non-alcoholic beverages and transport. So how can this plan say the poverty incidence will drop from the current 23.7 poverty rate to 9.7 9% in 2028. Since makikita po natin doon sa history, hindi bumaba ng kahit na 1 digit ang poverty rate.
Mr. Speaker, if you look at the inflation data, isang malaking source of inflation is really petroleum products, transport sector, etc. So sa MTFF, ito pong layunin to ensure energy security. Yan po ang tutugon sa problema ng inflation. Of course, nandito rin ang food security. As you had mentioned, ang pangalawang source of inflation sa buwan ng June is also food inflation, particularly meat and vegetables. So again, hindi ko na po ulitin, na-discuss na po natin na ang mga interventions para po mas maging produktiba ang ating mga magsasakayan po ang tutulong sa paglawak ng food supply and at the same time, ultimately to lower food prices, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So does the sponsors fiscal consolidation and resource mobilization include system reforms that will make sinasabi na natin to kanina, yung salary hike, increase spending for public health, education, housing, social welfare, and other basic social services? So would that include in the plan?
Mr. Speaker, what is clear in the plan is that we will be improving our collection of taxes. Kahit naman po itong imposition of VAT on digital services, ay masasabi natin arguably ay hindi imposition of new taxes because this is actually currently under our VAT law. Wala lang tayong paraan para kolektahin yan. So we will stick to pretty much just improving our efficiency in tax collection as opposed to introducing new taxes, Mr. Speaker.
And lastly, Mr. Speaker, are there plans on support to MSMEs and small establishments like schools and also to our agriculture and fishery sectors?
Mr. Speaker, ang tulong para sa MSMEs ay nakabalangkas sa iba't ibang mga layunin dito. For example, improvement in digital infrastructure. Alam natin na marami sa ating MSMEs have to rely on the use of internet, the use of cell phone services. Nandito rin po ang encouraging R&D and innovation. So again, our MSMEs will benefit greatly from R&D programs. Alam naman natin that that's the sure way to improve productivity of our MSMEs. So kahit sabihin natin na 96% ang ating establishments ay MSMEs, ang malaking problema sa ating MSMEs ay hindi sila ganon ka-productive. So lahat ng mga nabalangkas dito sa MTFF ay tungo sa i-improve ng productivity ng ating MSMEs, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. So nakita natin, Mr. Speaker, thank you sa mga sagot ng ating sponsor. So nakita natin, Mr. Speaker, that this medium-term fiscal framework for 2022 to 2028, I think it is very ambitious and unrealistic. Okay? So sino po ba yung magtitipid dito, no? Nakita natin maliit naman yung increase sa budget. Nakita natin na yung contributor sa economic growth like yung secure job, yung salary, at saka syempre yung mga livelihood na dapat na binibigay natin sa ating mga mamamayan ay wala po akong nakita, no, gaano nakita dito sa plan. So this MTFF ay tingin ko ay pagtitipid sa bahagi ng ating mga mamamayan. So habang nagtitipid tayo ng ating ng ating sinturon, yung ating mga mamamayan naman ay hindi sila masisecure doon sa job, food, and other basic services. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honorable Floor Leader, Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move to recognize Representative Arlene Brosas of the Gabriela Party List for her interpellation.
The Honorable Arlene Brosas of Party List Gabriela is recognized for her interpellation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maraming salamat, Mr. Speaker. Will the Madam Sponsor yield to a few questions from this representation?
Mr. Speaker, yes, gladly, my dear colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Sponsor, we take this opportunity to seek clarifications on House Concurrent Resolution number 2, which lends the support of the House to the administration's medium-term fiscal framework 2022 to 2028. Mahalaga pong maunawaan ng mga kababaihan at mamayang Pilipino ito. Kaya Ginoong Speaker, Madam Sponsor, may we know the assumptions behind the projections made by the administration's economic managers as outlined in the House Concurrent Resolution number 2. Halimbawa po, yung annual real GDP growth na 6.5 to 8% from 2023 to 2028, single-digit poverty rate by 2028, yan po yung mga ano po yung assumptions doon?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as explained earlier, ang mga targets na ito ay nanggagaling sa mga macroeconomic models na ina-estimate po ng ating economic managers, meaning NEDA, DOF, and DBM. So, nandyan po, nandyan ang baseline data, kung ano ang current natin na growth rate, kung anong current natin na poverty incidence, current natin inflation rate, and based on their modeling using data, ay ito po ang naging resulta ng kanilang forecasts. Mr. Speaker, Madam Sponsor, hindi po ba't malayong-malayo ang projections na ito sa aktual na karanasan ng ating mga kababayan ngayon? The Philippine economy remains dependent on externalities such as overseas remittances, cheap exports, and foreign investments. Wala tayong sariling industriya, nakaasa sa imported na pagkain, pati po bigas. Highest importer tayo ng bigas. Isa tayo sa pinakamalaking importer nito, at isa rin sa pinaka-vulnerable sa nagbabadyang food crisis. Nasa 6.1. Kanina, paulit-ulit po nating sinasabi, 6.1% ang inflasyon nitong Hunyo at nakikitang magpapatuloy ito sa mas mataas pa, ang magiging inflasyon. Fundamental po ang mga weaknesses na ito.
Madam Sponsor. Kaya paano natin naabutin yung mga matatayog na projections na sinasabi ninyo kanina, Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Madam Sponsor?
Madam Speaker, I stand by my statement earlier na hindi naman po unreasonable ang ating 2010 all the way ang ating GDP growth rate ay nasa at least 6%, and we have done that, we have achieved that consistently.